Breaking news to bring you out of Washington this hour. It appears there is movement in the trade negotiations between Canada and the U.S.
In a move that flew under the radar, General Motors just made a billion-dollar deal that could cost Americans their jobs and reshape the future of the car industry. General Motors didn't hold a press conference. There was no handshake, no announcement, no warning. Just a quiet agreement with Canada that redirected billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the future of an entire industry away from the United States. And here's the part no one's talking about. This wasn't about growth, it was about escape. What does this mean for American workers and factories? Why didn't Washington stop it? And what happens when your vehicle, your paycheck, and your economy are all tied to a deal you never voted for? Because by the time this video ends, you'll realize this wasn't just a strategy. It was a warning shot, the silent deal that changed everything. It happened without warning. No press release, no live broadcast, no politician cutting a ribbon or shaking hands in front of a smiling crowd. Instead, what General Motors executed was a quiet, calculated shift of billions of dollars across the border, away from the United States and straight into Canada's waiting hands. While American headlines were dominated by tariffs, speeches, and culture wars, the real game was being played behind closed doors. General Motors had inked an industrial pact with Ontario and Quebec so quietly that most Americans never even heard it happen. By the time the filings were made public, it was too late. Equipment was already moving, construction had already begun, and American cities were already being left behind. This was not a merger. It was not an expansion, it was an extraction. The plan focused on relocating major vehicle production and battery development to new Canadian hubs, including electric vehicle platforms that had originally been promised to Midwestern states. Billions in government incentives, workforce development programs, and long-term tax guarantees were funneled into Canadian factories, while American towns waited for calls that never came. What was once considered America's automotive backbone was now just a loose end in someone else's plan. It was not just the scale of the deal that shocked insiders, it was the speed. From confidential blueprints to hiring announcements, the entire transition was mapped with chilling precision. And yet, no one in Michigan, Ohio, or Indiana had been warned. As the final paperwork cleared in Ottawa, one question echoed louder than the rest. How did General Motors move billions without a single American town noticing? And then the consequences became very real. Factories moved, families forgotten. In towns like Flint, Lordstown, and Spring Hill, there was a familiar hum that once defined daily life. The shift bell, the loading dock, the distant roar of engines being tested for the first time. These were not just towns with factories, they were towns built around them. Neighborhoods sprouted up around assembly plants. Schools were named after engineers. Generations of families worked under the same corporate badge. And now that legacy was being torn away, not with a bang, but with an email. When news broke that General Motors had moved its next-generation electric vehicle production north of the border, it landed like a funeral notice. For many workers, it wasn't just a job loss, it was an identity collapse. Retirees who had given 30 or 40 years were left asking whether it had all meant anything. Younger employees, those who had stayed loyal through wage freezes, healthcare cuts, and automation, were told they were simply too expensive to keep. Union halls that once echoed with strategy sessions and grievance filings now held silence and bottled water. Emergency meetings were called. Spouses canceled summer plans. Real estate agents quietly started listing home. The betrayal was not just economic, it was emotional. These were communities that had weathered recessions, bankruptcies, and foreign competition, believing that loyalty would one day be rewarded. Instead, they were erased from the future without a second glance. And yet, General Motors had prepared for the outrage. Internal communications discouraged American executives from engaging with negative regional feedback. The corporation had insulated itself legally, logistically, and publicly. By the time workers realized what was happening, their roles had already been relocated, literally. As community leaders begged for answers, the silence from Washington was deafening. Can you believe what's happening right now? America's automotive backbone is breaking, and we're just now realizing it. If you've been affected by this shift, or just want to learn more, hit the subscribe button. The political shield that made it possible. No one in Congress admitted they saw it coming. Yet buried deep within regulatory filings and transportation board minutes were the signs of a shift already in motion. The truth, General Motors did not outmaneuver Washington overnight. It did it slowly, strategically, and with full knowledge that political paralysis would protect it from consequences. Federal oversight of corporate investment had weakened. There were no strings attached to electric vehicle subsidies, no production quotas tied to American soil, no penalty clauses for offshoring battery development. These omissions were not oversights. They were political trade-offs. Lawmakers, eager to look pro-business, passed incentive packages that quietly allowed automakers to move wherever the deals were better. When General Motors found more predictable labor rates, stronger permitting systems, and deeper subsidy pools in Ontario and Quebec, the decision was easy. Canada made itself the safer bet. Washington, meanwhile, continued to fight over ideology instead of infrastructure. Every time Congress delayed an energy bill or undercut a manufacturing initiative, companies took notes. By the time Canada was ready to offer full-scale partnership and investment certainty, General Motors had no reason to stay, and so it didn't. What sealed the silence around the move was insulation. Legal teams were told to avoid language that would trigger federal scrutiny. Lobbyists framed the deal as a North American partnership rather than an outsourcing strategy. And in Washington, the focus remained elsewhere, on headlines, on hearings, on everything but the quiet collapse of industrial power. This was not just a policy failure, it was a surrender by distraction. Now, American workers were paying the price for a game their leaders refused to play. Tariff shock, Trump's explosive response. The headlines did not see it coming. While reporters focused on labor statistics and campaign soundbites, President Donald Trump was handed a perfect political weapon. News of General Motors' billion-dollar shift to Canada had barely reached the public before Trump took the stage in western Pennsylvania. He was supposed to give a prepared speech on infrastructure. He tossed the teleprompter script aside and stared straight into the camera. What he delivered next was not policy. It was a declaration of war. If General Motors thinks it can build cars in Canada and ship them back to the United States tariff-free, Trump said, they're about to find out what a 200% tariff feels like. The audience erupted. The comment was no longer a throwaway line. It became a rallying cry. Within hours, every major news outlet had the quote splashed across their homepage. Financial markets flinched. General Motors stock dipped, and trade lawyers scrambled to assess whether such a move was legally enforceable. None of that mattered to the president. He was not playing by the rules of international commerce. He was playing to the anger of middle America. Behind the scenes, campaign staffers pushed press releases attacking General Motors as traitors to the American worker. The company, they argued, had taken years of federal subsidies, enjoyed regulatory carve-outs, and reaped the benefits of consumer loyalty, only to move its newest production line across the border. In Trump's eyes, this was not just outsourcing, it was betrayal. With that single moment, the gloves were off. A new crisis was about to unfold, this time at the dealership level. America's supply chain starts to crack. Dealerships from Texas to Maine began reporting a quiet catastrophe. New inventory was no longer arriving. Rows of trucks, crossovers, and family sedans that once filled their lots had vanished. Allocation numbers dropped without warning. In some states, dealers received less than 10% of their usual shipment. Others skipped entire product lines for months. The blame wasn't a chip shortage or pandemic backlog. The vehicles were not missing. They were moving, and they were going north. General Motors had rerouted its supply chains. Under the new Canadian strategy, dealerships in Ontario and Quebec were now the priority. They received the newest electric vehicle models first. They got the test programs, the financing incentives, the press rollouts. American dealers, they were left with empty lots, unanswered emails, and furious customers. What followed was a collapse of trust. Buyers walked into showrooms expecting to negotiate. Instead, they were met with apologies. No vehicles, no timelines, no discounts. Floor managers, desperate to keep doors open, had nothing to offer. General Motors Financial tightened its lending requirements, slashing credit access just as prices spiked. Loyalty rebates were quietly canceled. 0% financing vanished. The consumer relationship, once the strongest pillar of the domestic auto business, was crumbling. And to understand how this happened, we have to talk about the strategy that made it possible in the first place. Canada's clean industrial coup. Canada did not win this war by accident. It won by design. For over a decade, Ottawa and the provincial governments of Ontario and Quebec built what Washington failed to even imagine: a clean, efficient, politically stable industrial corridor. While the United States bickered over climate bills and EV tax credits, Canada quietly planted the seeds of economic dominance, and now those seeds are blooming. It began with targeted investment. Canadian provinces offered guaranteed land access, infrastructure support, and rapid permitting for electric vehicle manufacturers. Lithium, nickel, and cobalt supply chains were vertically integrated. Labor training programs were embedded in local universities and trade schools. Instead of relying on federal gridlock, Canada created a business environment where certainty, not chaos, was the selling point. General Motors saw that certainty. So did every major automaker looking to build next-generation factories. In Toronto and Montreal, there were no protests against EV mandates. There were streamlined approval pipelines. Environmental compliance was clear, consistent, and predictable. That mattered to boardrooms. It meant they could forecast, invest, and launch, all without bracing for lawsuits or media firestorms. Even more critically, Canada promised partnership without micromanagement. While Washington flipped between competing agendas every 2 years, Ottawa delivered continuity. In the words of one anonymous GM executive, Canada doesn't just offer deals, it offers peace of mind. And in this new industrial era, peace of mind is more valuable than any tax break. Canada did not steal American jobs. It made itself irresistible to companies that had run out of patience. The result was not just a shift in production. It was a strategic capture of the future. Now, with factories moving and workers rising, the next phase of this crisis is already underway. Congress declares war on corporate offshoring. The backlash from Capitol Hill came fast, and it came with teeth. Within 48 hours of General Motors announcing its multi-billion-dollar relocation to Canada, both chambers of Congress were flooded with draft bills, press releases, and emergency committee meetings. It was not just partisan outrage. It was bipartisan fury, aimed squarely at companies that had accepted U.S. subsidies while preparing to offshore production. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri accused General Motors of corporate betrayal funded by taxpayer dollars. Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio went even further, declaring, "If you take American money, you build on American soil." Period. The rhetoric was no longer vague. It was surgical. Lawmakers were looking for scalps, and General Motors was first in line. One bill proposed revoking all electric vehicle subsidies from any manufacturer that builds battery components outside the continental United States. Another would make any company ineligible for federal fleet contracts unless at least 80% of their vehicles are produced domestically. Still another, more controversial, aimed to classify companies like General Motors as strategic defectors, allowing the federal government to recover grants, demand penalties, and bar participation in future green infrastructure programs. Behind closed doors, lobbyists scrambled. General Motors legal teams requested emergency meetings with key senators. Phone calls went out to the governors of affected states. Their pitch: flexibility is not treason, it is survival. But the mood in Washington had already shifted. For once, the anger was not just symbolic, it was legislative. The stakes were far greater than corporate punishment. They were the very foundation of a decades-old economic alliance, the collapse of the Auto Alliance. The United States and Canada once operated as a single machine. Components flowed from Windsor to Detroit, labor was shared, and manufacturing was optimized across borders. That unspoken agreement, forged through decades of trust and industrial codependence, is now unraveling. The General Motors relocation marked more than a business shift. It was the final crack in a structure that had held since the post-war boom. Ottawa no longer sees the United States as a dependable trade partner. American tariffs are too unpredictable. Its regulatory signals are too politicized. Canadian leaders watched Washington stall on green energy, delay infrastructure bills, and threaten tariffs on allies. So they made a choice to go it alone. General Motors was not poached. It saw a stable, incentive-rich system in Canada and chose the path of least resistance. That choice had a ripple effect. Binational production planning has been suspended. Joint vehicle platforms are being restructured for domestic-only output. Ontario's Ministry of Economic Development has shifted to direct talks with automakers, excluding former U.S. partners from key discussions. Quebec's battery recycling initiative was originally designed as a North American project. It is now a Canadian sovereign asset. In meetings from Detroit to Washington, executives are describing the alliance as functionally dead. No formal treaty was broken, no press release was issued, but the integration is finished, and with its collapse comes a quiet panic. If the most mature industrial alliance in the Western Hemisphere can fail without warning, what other pillars of global cooperation are now at risk? That realization feeds directly into a forensic look at how America allowed this slow-motion collapse to happen in plain sight. Washington's decade of delusion. The auto industry did not leave the United States overnight. It was pushed, gently, repeatedly, and with full knowledge of what would happen. Over the last 10 years, lawmakers had every opportunity to build a competitive environment for next-generation manufacturing. Instead, they chose short-term headlines over structural reform. The result is not just the loss of one company or one factory. It is a systemic failure of national strategy. Congress delayed major infrastructure bills for years. It passed fragmented electric vehicle tax credits that excluded key automakers, confused consumers, and alienated allies. It ignored industry white papers, warning of foreign battery dependency. Environmental permitting reforms were introduced, watered down, and then discarded in each session. And still, politicians stood at podiums and claimed leadership. Meanwhile, companies like General Motors were not waiting. They filed transition roadmaps. They requested clarity on emission standards, battery recycling policy, and worker retraining funds. What they received was political gridlock and messaging wars. In contrast, Canada responded with one voice, a national strategy, unified incentives, real delivery. By the time Washington noticed that billions were moving across the border, it was too late. The land had been allocated, the labor deals signed, the infrastructure shovel-ready. America's warnings came after the fact, sounding more like excuses than leadership. And this is not about one party. Republican deregulation failed to create sustainable industrial growth. Democratic overpromising burned through public trust. Both sides played politics while the world restructured its economy. And as that reality crashes down on Main Street, the most visible symptom is not a bill in Congress. It is a dealership with empty lots and fading lights. The dealership death spiral. The consequences are now showing up where Americans notice them most, on the sales floor. Across the country, General Motors dealerships are collapsing under the weight of inventory starvation and financial uncertainty. Rows of pickups, SUVs, and crossovers that once defined local economies are vanishing. In Texas, allocations have dropped by more than 80%. In Michigan, some dealers report skipping entire model cycles. The product pipeline is not delayed, it is dried up. This is not just a supply issue. It is a trust issue. Customers walk into showrooms expecting to negotiate, only to find no vehicles, no rebates, and no financing options. General Motors' internal financing arm has tightened credit requirements and eliminated promotional rates. Dealers are being told to focus on the customer experience while having nothing to actually sell. Some owners have already shut their doors. Others are using personal lines of credit to keep the lights on. Staff retention is collapsing. Loyalty programs are being quietly abandoned. And the most damaging development, former General Motors customers are defecting to brands that can still deliver vehicles on demand. This is no longer about brand loyalty. It is about availability, affordability, and faith. General Motors' corporate decisions have left thousands of retail businesses in the cold. These are not abstract metrics. They are real businesses in real communities, watching a generational relationship crumble. And what happens when these dealers give up? When the face of American automotive power, the franchise dealer, vanishes from the local landscape. It means the foundation of car culture in America is being erased, one silent showroom at a time. Ford's new identity, no longer American. Ford Motor Company may still market trucks and SUVs, but internally it has already undergone a quiet transformation. The company no longer defines itself as a vehicle manufacturer. Instead, it positions itself as a mobility platform. That term may sound like jargon, but it signals something profound. In Ford's boardrooms, the core business is no longer about building machines. It is about managing movement, fleets, logistics, subscriptions, and data ecosystems. Physical assembly is now treated as a liability. Real profits flow from code, not combustion. This shift began with Ford's growing reliance on telematics, vehicle software that collects behavioral data, predicts maintenance, and connects directly to cloud-based systems. What started as a side utility has grown into the company's central nervous system. From there, Ford invested in predictive analytics, software as a service platforms for fleet operators, and subscription-based vehicle features. The more software it deployed, the less dependent it became on traditional labor. Manufacturing jobs that once defined the company were now marginal to the core business model. Research teams in Toronto and Ottawa now lead development of Ford's autonomous delivery pods and micromobility units. These teams are not tasked with building engines. They are designing artificial intelligence that will decide when and how vehicles move through city networks. Ford's partnerships with Canadian telecom providers are not about cars at all. They are about controlling data lanes, bandwidth, and integration into smart infrastructure grids. In short, Ford has morphed into a logistics tech hybrid with a legacy nameplate, which raises the uncomfortable question: if Ford no longer needs American roads, labor, or regulators to survive, can it still be considered an American company? The answer becomes clearer when you zoom out and examine the wider industrial map that Ford and others are now redrawing. The new global auto map. For over a century, the global auto industry was oriented around the United States. Detroit, Michigan was the nerve center. The International Auto Show set the tone. American buyers drove volume. American culture shaped design. That gravitational pull is now gone. The global auto map has fractured and realigned around new centers of gravity. Japan has scaled back exports to the United States by over 60%, redirecting its shipments towards Southeast Asia and the European Union. South Korea is doubling down on its partnerships with the Netherlands and Germany. Mexico, once treated as a subcontractor for American brands, is building its own export footprint into South America and Africa. Meanwhile, Canada has surged ahead as a favored production hub, not for Americans, but for global markets that offer political stability, cheap energy, and growing middle classes. The game has changed. Instead of chasing the U.S. market, manufacturers are building flexible ecosystems that adapt to multiple regions. Countries like Vietnam, Brazil, and Indonesia are no longer afterthoughts. They are rising nodes in a decentralized supply chain, and the decisions are not being made in Detroit or Washington. They are being made in Seoul, Munich, and Toronto. Investment flows are tracking stability, speed, and incentive alignment, not patriotism. The auto world is still expanding, but the American portion of it is shrinking. The country that once exported muscle cars, design language, and industrial culture now finds itself increasingly isolated. American-made vehicles are no longer the default, and American regulations no longer set global benchmarks. The balance of power has shifted. What remains to be asked is not where these vehicles are made, but why the very nature of vehicle creation has changed altogether. The final betrayal: digital over labor. What once defined industrial success was scale. You built large factories, hired thousands of workers, and produced high-volume machinery. In the modern automotive world, that formula is obsolete. Today, companies are rewarded not for how many workers they employ, but how many lines of code they own. The great betrayal of the modern labor movement is not offshoring. It is digitization. Ford's pivot is emblematic of this shift. Instead of reinvesting in large American production centers, it is hiring software developers in clusters like Kitchener, Ontario, and Bangalore, India. These employees do not bend metal, they build algorithms. Instead of organizing assembly lines, they optimize routing efficiency, monitor subscription engagement, and engineer self-driving decision trees. One software engineer now generates more long-term value than a team of machinists. This is not a moral statement. It is a market fact. Labor is no longer seen as a force multiplier. It is a cost anchor. Flexibility, automation, and AI-led scalability are the metrics that win boardroom approvals. The workforce that once built the industrial age is being sidelined in the digital one. And this is not unique to Ford. Across the industry, engineering has been replaced with integration. Factories are modular. Talent is remote. Vehicles are coded as much as they are constructed. Tesla understood this early. General Motors is following fast, and Ford has already stopped pretending. It is not trying to rebuild the past, it is designing around it. This shift doesn't just leave American workers behind. It leaves the entire American industrial identity behind. And with that, we arrive at the final realization. American automotive power has not been disrupted. It has been dissolved. The end of American car power. There was no parade, no presidential address, no press conference. The end of American automotive dominance came quietly, while most of the country was arguing about gas prices and electric chargers. But the signs are now undeniable. Inventory in American dealerships has plummeted. Job growth in the sector is flat or negative, and vehicle affordability for the average American family is at a 50-year low. Meanwhile, global manufacturers are bypassing the United States entirely. Companies that once built empires in Michigan are now drawing their future maps without a single American zip code. Even when new vehicles are offered in the U.S., they are often shipped in limited quantities, with inflated prices and restricted incentives. Automakers no longer see the United States as a foundational market. It is just another destination, and not always a profitable one. The influence that once came from setting safety standards, pioneering engine technology, and defining design now belongs to others. The European Union writes the sustainability rules. China dominates battery manufacturing. South Korea leads in autonomous tech patents. The center of gravity has shifted, and America is no longer in orbit. Ford, General Motors, and Tesla will still exist. They may even thrive, but their prosperity is no longer tied to the prosperity of the American worker. That linkage is gone. What has replaced it is a model where the company wins and the country does not. The American auto industry has been rewritten, and the consequences are far-reaching. General Motors made its move, and now it's up to us to figure out how to adapt. If you learned something new today, please like, share, and subscribe for more inside looks into the collapse of American car power. Thanks for watching.